Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading How It Feels by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 49, Fear. Ruby had always thought Vale looked really pretty at night. Surrounded by an ever-encroaching darkness, the kingdom stood alone as the only source of light on the horizon. In that light, people sought safety and security, something they quite frequently found. Though it would be wrong to say they lived carefree, as even the city had its issues, it was at least a life away from the harsh horrors that lay beyond the city walls. Free of the darkness and protected by walls and mountains, they were able to start families and live out their dreams, whatever those dreams were. Each light that she saw represented one such person. Each light was someone who was happy, or at least safe. Each light was someone who wouldn't be sleeping with one eye open, with a weapon beside them that would be raised to defend oneself at a moment's notice. And as a huntress, each light filled her with pride. Pride towards every hunter that came before her and protected that light. Pride towards herself for one day protecting it herself. Not just for the city down below, but every city like it across Remnant. However, while normally that thought would comfort and reassure her, Ruby was in too dour a mood to appreciate it as she normally would. Sat atop the dormitory building, the cool breeze blowing through her hair, Ruby couldn't help but acknowledge that the day had been a mess. While it had started off well with a nice team bonding session, and Weiss finally accepting that her summons were acting alone, it had taken a sharp turn during, and after, their mission to clear the blockage. She had known Blake was in a rough mood. She had been for nearly a week, but Blake was refusing to open up to her properly. It was very reminiscent of when they had first been placed on a team together. The girl was grouchy, untalkative, and a little snappy. But Ruby knew that was only because the fauness was worried about her parents' visit, and just wished the girl would talk to them about it. When they had got back from the mission though, Blake had still been angry and had immediately stormed off to the library, leaving Ruby a little unsure as to what she had actually done wrong. She had seen Blake down and rushed to help, just as she had with any member of her team in the past. None of them had ever been mad at her before. Unfortunately, since Blake had stormed off, she couldn't exactly ask. So instead, after getting some of her coursework done, she had left the dorm herself and slumped her way up to the roof to get some air. And that was where she had been sitting for an hour, her legs resting over the edge as she slowly thought over the day and how she would fix things with Blake. Before she could think any further though, the loud sound of metal against stone caught her ear, and she turned to see Young pushing her way through the door with a bottle in her hand. The blonde has also not been seen since they had returned from their mission, having hurried off after Blake. "Hey, Rubles," she said, kicking the door shut behind her and walking over. "Why said I'd find you up here?" With the grace of a huntress, she jumped up onto the ledge and sat down. "You okay?" "Yeah," Ruby replied. "Just thinking about stuff. How's Blake?" "Still a little angry," the girl hummed and took a sip of her drink. "But she'll calm down." "I hope so." Ruby sighed and reached out to take the drink from her sister, who handed it to her. Taking a sip, she immediately spat it back out and began to cough as a nasty taste filled her mouth. She couldn't quite describe what it tasted like, but she knew it was definitely something she never wanted to try again. Jan, on the other hand, simply laughed and pulled the drink back. "Is that beer?" Ruby coughed, trying to get the taste out of her mouth. "Yup. You'll like it when you get older." "No, I won't," Ruby said with absolute certainty. Lilac eyes looked at her in amusement, before the brawler's lips settled on a wide grin. Shaking her head, Yang reached into her pocket and pulled out a chocolate milkshake, which she quickly handed over. Giving it a firm shake, Ruby ripped the cap off and guzzled down a few mouthfuls, letting out a happy sigh as the horrible taste of beer was replaced with the pleasant aftertaste of chocolate. "Better?" Yang chuckled. "Much better." She breathed and gave the beer in Yang's hand a nasty look. "How do you drink that stuff?" "It's an acquired taste." Yang laughed and took a sip. "But if any of the teachers ask, it's just apple juice." "Got it." Ruby nodded and turned back to look out over the city. For a couple of minutes, they sat there in silence and simply sipped away at their drinks. Normally, after a mistake like that, Yang would tease her mercilessly, so the fact that she was quiet told Ruby that there was something on the girl's mind. Not wanting to rush her sister, as anything that had her held up was usually something she was unsure how to discuss, she waited patiently for whatever was going to be said. However, the words that came out of the girl's mouth were definitely not what Ruby expected. "I get why she's mad, you know. The blonde sighed, taking another sip of her drink. I don't like that she shouted at you, but I can't say I haven't felt the same way as she does. You're mad that I saved her too? Ruby asked, looking down at her knees. Not that you saved her, Ruby. Jan groaned. That you thought you needed to. Silence filled the space again as Yang placed down the drink and looked out over the city of Vale. Daring to glance at her sister, Ruby saw there was sadness in her lilac eyes. It was unusual to see such a thing, since the girl usually bottled everything up, and Ruby felt horrible for seemingly being the one who put it there. Do you know what the most terrifying moment of my life has been, Rubes? Yang asked quietly, not pulling her gaze from the city. No, Ruby replied. There had only been a few times that she had seen her sister scared after all. When? It was the day Crow agreed to train you. That was an answer she had definitely not been expecting, but Jan elaborated further. I asked him to say no. I tried begging him to keep you away from this because I knew who you become. As Ruby processed that unknown fact, she heard a slight grinding and looked down to see Jan's hands were gripping the stone ledge with enough force that small parts were beginning to crumble away. I watched you grow up. Hell, I practically raised you. I remember every question you asked me. I remember every story that you loved more than the others, and I always answered them honestly because I never wanted to lie to you. But the more you grew, the more you trained, and how you spoke of being a huntress, the more I saw that you were becoming like Mom. Yang shook her head. And I know that, just like Mom, there will come a day when I'll lose you. That one day you'll go on a mission and never come back. And as proud as I am of you, Ruby, the fact that you will put your life at risk so easily for anyone is something that has always terrified me. But every day I push it aside. I support you and try to make sure you're as ready as possible. The blonde gave a small sniffle, and Ruby looked up to see tears in the girl's eyes. And then you do shit like this, and I'm reminded all over again, she croaked. Coming to terms with this isn't easy, Ruby, and I don't want an apology, but for anyone who knows you, the thought of losing you is like being stabbed in the heart. So yes, I get why Blake was angry. You knew she didn't need help, yet you jumped in to protect her. You put her life over yours, and the last time you did that, you almost died. Looking away as a tear dropped down Yang's cheek, Ruby felt a mix of emotions. She definitely remembered the hit she had taken against the Helk, and remembered Blake hadn't been very happy about it during the recovery, but she thought that had been put behind them after they'd talked about it. Apparently that wasn't the case. But Ruby had no idea what she could do to change that. The willingness to sacrifice herself was never a choice. For her, it had always just been what was right. Yang was right that it had always been an innate part of her personality, something that had always been her. It was never that she wanted to die, only that she was ready whenever that moment came. And that wasn't going to change. Or at least, it never had so far. So what do I do? Ruby mumbled. I don't want to change who I am. We're not asking you to do that. Yang breathed, picking her drink back up and taking a sip as she wiped her eyes. Neither of us want you to change who you are. We just want you to remember that we don't need you saving us from the little things. We can handle ourselves. I know you can. Ruby pouted, taking a sip of her milkshake. I just reacted. Well, Yang sighed and looked at her. Maybe that's what we work on. Making sure you don't throw yourself into danger for something minor. Knowing that was definitely something she could work on, Ruby gave her sister a small nod. Maybe we could start practicing hand-to-hand again too? She offered. We can definitely pick up where we left off. Yang smiled, pulling Ruby into a hug. A kiss was pressed against the side of her head. You do know I'm really proud of you though. Right. I do. Ruby sighed happily, leaning into her sister's warm aura. Good. Yang took another sip of her drink, and so did Ruby. She really wasn't sure what had caused her sister to become more open recently. Maybe it was what had happened over the break, but she was really liking it, even if the honesty was sometimes not exactly what she wanted to hear. Placing her pen down and stretching her arms above her head, Ruby glanced into the small mirror that sat on her partner's desk to see Blake was sat curled up under her blanket reading a book. It had been a whole 24 hours since their argument, and the two of them had still yet to talk about it, and it was really starting to bug her. For the first time in weeks, the two had not shared a bed for the night, and Ruby still remembered how lonely she had felt the night before. It was an odd feeling, since she had slept alone for years, but waking up without Blake beside her had left her feeling a little off for the entire day. It had even been hard to focus on the coursework she had spent the last hour trying to complete, though unfortunately had not, despite it being due the next day. So rather tired from the silence and the mountain of coursework that she still had left, Ruby decided it was finally time for them to talk and stood up from her seat and turned to look at her sister. Catching the blonde's eyes, she motioned towards Weiss. Thankfully, the girl understood. "All right, people," the girl yawned, stretching her arms and jumping down from her top bunk. "I really need a break, and we all need some food. Any complaints about garlands? Can't you just get something delivered from the food court?" Blake mumbled, not lowering her book. "It'll be quicker." "Nah. We've been eating rather unhealthy lately." The girl grinned and grabbed her jacket. "And I really want some good mushrooms." "Fine." Blake sighed and prepared to shuffle from her bed. "Let me just get Dre Dash." "Me and Weiss have got it," Yang interrupted with a pointed look to the heiress. "Right, Weiss?" "Yes." The girl nodded quickly and pulled on her boots. "You two can talk while we are out." "Real subtle, Weiss." "I don't care for subtleties." "That is true." While Ruby watched her teammates get ready to leave, she saw Blake's ears flatten against her head as she shifted back on her bed and resumed her reading. The move not exactly filling with confidence, she slipped her hands into the pockets of her skirt and looked down nervously at her legs. However, a few seconds later, she felt a hand land on her shoulder and a warmth flowed through her. Looking to her side, she saw Weiss giving her a small smile, the bracelet on her wrist glowing a bright red for a moment before she let go and followed Yang out of the room. Left alone, she felt her nerves grow and moved over to sit on Weiss' bed. Having never really been in an argument like it before, she had no real idea what to do, but she figured the best thing would be to at least make an attempt to talk to her girlfriend. So picking at the lining of her skirt, she gave a small cough. "Good book?" "Haven't finished it yet," Blake replied shortly, making no attempt to further the discussion. "Oh," Ruby hummed, a little confused. "Do you need to finish it to know if it's good?" "Bad endings can ruin good build-up and ruin the experience," Blake replied dully, not turning her eyes away from the pages. "Good endings can salvage bad build-up and save the experience." "I guess that's true," she mumbled. Fiddling with her socks, she watched her girlfriend and realized that while they weren't looking up from the book, she wasn't actually reading anything. Her ears were also still flattened against her head, and Ruby knew that meant the girl was upset. With both of those things in mind, a sudden thought ran through her mind and filled her with sadness. So much so that she couldn't help but express her fear. "Are you breaking up with me?" she muttered quietly. "What?" The reply was immediate. "Why would you think that?" "I don't know." Ruby shrugged anxiously. "You won't talk to me, and you're mad about something I can't apologize for. What else am I supposed to think?" "I'm not mad at—" Blake cut herself off with a sigh and sat up straight, dropping her book to the bed. "Okay, I am. You got in the way of my attack. You didn't trust me to handle myself, and that got us both hurt." "I didn't mean to," Ruby countered sullenly. "I just saw you were down and wanted to dash." "But that's not the only time, Ruby," Blake interrupted. "You acted like I couldn't handle myself against a few Beowulfs while you fought the siren. You almost died trying to sacrifice yourself to get me away from the Helk, something I told you to stop doing. You jammed your side stopping a wisp that I knew was there. You keep doing it." "I know. I just don't want to risk losing people when I could save them." "So you think it's okay for us to lose you instead?" Blake snapped quickly, a little irritation in her voice. "That isn't better for us, you know. Why do you think I've been training so hard with Xanthia? I don't want you sacrificing yourself, especially for me, and am trying my best to make sure that doesn't happen. But none of our training as a team, means anything if you don't trust that I can handle myself in the field." "I do trust you," Ruby scowled. "I've always trusted you." "Well, it doesn't feel like it." "I do," she repeated and leaned forward. "I really do, I just—" Ruby let out a low breath and pulled her legs up to her chest. "It's not about trust. I just don't want people to potentially get hurt if I can stop it." "And that's fine," Blake said firmly. "I get that, Ruby, but I'm not just another civilian who's walking on the streets. I'm a huntress, just like you. You don't need to be constantly looking out for me when we're supposed to be looking out for others. How am I supposed to do my job when I have to look over my shoulder for both you and Grim getting in my way?" Ruby could definitely understand that point. It was always difficult enough to fight against an opponent while keeping an eye on your surroundings. But to make sure someone you didn't want to hurt wasn't getting in your way would be even harder. That shouldn't have been an issue since their teamwork was nearly impeccable, but clearly it had happened. Had they fallen off? Were they no longer as aligned as they used to be? Or had it simply been her fault for acting too hastily and letting her impulses get the better of her? You're right. Ruby nodded slowly. You shouldn't have to worry about that. But... Blake's eyebrow raised, and Ruby hesitated for a minute. While her girlfriend was right about everything she had said, that had not been the only thing that had caused an issue during their mission. And though she didn't want to risk irritating the faunus anymore, she knew it was her duty as team leader to bring it up. So clearing her nerves, she looked into the girl's beautiful eyes and continued. But we shouldn't have to worry about you attracting Grimm to us either, she said as clearly as she could. Though she had expected to see anger flare in Blake's eyes, just as they had when Yang had confronted her after the fight, she was a little surprised to see them filled with shame as they fell to the bed. I get you're worried about seeing your parents, Blake, but you can't bring that with you on missions. I know that. Blake sighed and shook her head. But I don't know what to do. Talk to me, Ruby said quietly, dropping her legs and moving to the edge of the bed. I've been trying to get you to talk to me all week, but you keep pushing me away. You're not sleeping properly, and I know you've skipped some meals. So please, just tell me what's wrong. Blake was silent for a good few minutes. The irritated aura that had surrounded the girl earlier had quickly faded to one of doubt and uncertainty as her fingers fiddled with the pages of her book. Content not to force Blake into sharing, Ruby simply waited and kept a kind expression on her face in an attempt to make the girl feel comfortable. Thankfully, the girl eventually let out a short breath and leaned back against the wall, pulling her blanket up to cover herself as she shrank into the corner a little. My dad always knew everything they did, so he'll know everything I did, she mumbled, wrapping herself tightly in the material. I know I didn't kill anyone myself, but I still hurt people and left others to Grimm. He might be preaching peace, but a piece of him will still be appalled by me. You don't know Th dash. I do. Blake cut her off. He hates violence. He'll forgive you. But a part of him will always hate me. I don't believe that. Ruby shook her head and stood up. And even if he does, so what? He'll still be there for you. It's not gonna stop him from accepting you. It didn't stop me. Walking over to Blake's bed, Ruby knelt down in front of the girl. For the first time in 24 hours, Blake didn't pull away, and Ruby considered that a good sign. I don't like what you did either, or that you hurt people, but I still accept you as you are, because that isn't you anymore. But all you've ever known is the best of me. I've never let you down like I did him. I learned a long time ago that when you let people down, it's harder for them to stay forgiving. Her voice quietened to a whisper. They always snap eventually. Blake. Ruby reached out to take her girlfriend's hand, but to her surprise, the faunus flinched away slightly, a hint of a shadow trailing behind her. I don't know what makes you think that, but your dad isn't going to be angry at you. Shifting her position on the bed, Ruby slipped under the blanket and sat beside her raven-haired teammate. She wasn't quite sure what had caused Blake to believe her dad would do those things, but she was certain they were all a figment of Blake's imagination. Maybe it had something to do with the girl's past, which she had always been very quiet about, but Ruby was determined to show her that there was nothing to be scared of. So, leaning her head against the girl's shoulder, she let out a low breath and pulled the blanket back over them both. You're a good person, Blake. She knew she had said it 100 times, but clearly Blake needed to hear it again. You did some bad things, but the most important thing is that you regret doing them. If someone can't see that, then that's their loss. Reaching out for Blake's hand again, she was glad to see the girl didn't flinch away and quickly linked their fingers while giving her a reassuring smile. But thankfully that isn't going to be an issue with your parents. How do you know that? Because I have hope, Ruby smiled. Enough for both of us if I need to. Blake's head finally looked up from the bed and turned to face her. Her ears were still pinned back on her head, and her eyes were brimming with sadness, but she quickly laid her head against Ruby's shoulder. Thanks, she whispered. Slipping her free hand around her girlfriend's waist, Ruby relaxed back into the wall and settled in for what would likely be a night of reassuring her girlfriend. Something she was definitely not opposed to doing. Chapter 50, Emergency. A loud buzzer rang through the area, and Ruby took a split second to breathe. On the side of the auditorium where their sparring class was taking place, Ren laid on the ground groaning slightly from the growing mass of rock on his chest that locked his arms at his side. The fight had been a tough one, but his shorter range had left him unable to get any real hits in, and RWBY had eventually managed to finish him with a well-placed slash from her rock-imbued blade. Unfortunately, Pyrrha was still standing, and pretty much untouched, while RWBY knew her aura levels were almost reaching orange. Thankfully, the girl's ankles were also encased in ice from the gunshot that had imbued the side's blade. It would normally be a moment she would capitalize on to throw an opponent off balance, but RWBY knew Pyrrha well enough to know the girl was very much on guard, so was taking a second to catch her breath instead since Ren was out of the fight. Not like she had much time to do that, however, as the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Hopping into the air, she avoided a bronze shield that spun underneath her and slamming into the stone, cracking it and releasing its captive. However, instead of returning the shield to her arm as she usually would, she used her semblance to keep it circling her. The girl had been a lot bolder with her semblance usage since it had been exposed in the tournament against Penny, and that had in turn made her even more of a formidable opponent. It was no longer just a defensive option, but something she also used on offense to great effect. As such, RWBY knew she had to be careful since she was still technically fighting two opponents, Pyrrha and her shield. However, since it was Pyrrha, RWBY knew she was free to hold nothing back since she was unlikely to win anyway. All she wanted from the fight was to do her best. "You got this, Rubes," Yang called from the sideline. Daring to cast a glance sideways, she saw her sister punching the air and sticking her tongue out at Ren while Blake held a tiny Team RWBY flag that RWBY had made as a joke at the beginning of their second semester. Weiss, on the other hand, was sitting upright and surveying her movements carefully. Though to many her lack of cheering might seem cold, RWBY knew that her best friend's current actions were typical when she was surveying potential competition, and it was that knowledge that sent a wave of confidence through her. Sensing movement in her peripheral, RWBY spun her scythe and shot the ground, boosting herself into the air just in time to dodge the javelin that lodged itself at her feet. Knowing the trick as she had seen it done plenty of times, she boosted herself to the side as Milo's trigger pulled itself and fired a round from its pole. Landing gracefully, she ducked below the shield that spun at her and fired another round at the Mistralian only for her to elegantly pirouette out of the way. Not wanting to give her a chance to recover her weapon, RWBY petal burst to her opponent. Before her first swing could even be finished, Akuo slammed into the side of Crescent Rose and threw her off course. Not letting it deter her though, as the shield returned to its owner's arm, RWBY flicked her weapon around and set it into motion. Sparks rained around them, as her scythe slammed repeatedly into Akuo's face. Dust was quick to join it too as rounds were intermittently fired off to increase the momentum, and while Pyrrha was deflecting most of them, she was quickly falling behind. Though Pyrrha was better on a technical level, RWBY knew she was faster, and with only a shield, she knew she could eventually overpower the redhead. She was a little curious why Pyrrha hadn't recalled her javelin yet though. Unfortunately, she was quick to find out. As her scythe made another rotation, Pyrrha spun to the side and raised her free hand that was crackling with black electricity, and though RWBY tried to stop her attack, Pyrrha's move was timed so perfectly that she didn't have time. While the head of Crescent Rose was designed to stop electricity from traveling to the pole, the outer shell of the handle was not insulated, so the second Pyrrha's hand touched it, a large surge of electricity tore up the shaft and flooded into RWBY's body. Gah! Despite her aura protecting her, the shock hurt like hell. Before she could even recover, a swift kick was delivered to her gut that sent her flying backwards. Recovering just in time to realize the trajectory she was on though, RWBY allowed herself to take the shot from Milo. Just before the bullet struck her back, however, she activated her semblance and allowed the petals to surround her, causing the area to be blanketed in red. Landing on her feet, she quickly sent off 2 more petals to where Milo was flying to and rushed back in. Gathering as much speed as she could, she tore from the cloud of petals and slammed her shoulder into Pyrrha. The Mistralian's shield came around to defend herself again, but the sheer velocity was too much for her arm to withstand, and her guard broke, causing her balance to falter. Seizing on it, RWBY swung her scythe low and swept the girl's feet out from under her. Following the momentum into the air, she pivoted and slammed her feet into Pyrrha's stomach and pushed off with all her might, sending the redhead crashing into the ground with enough force to create a small crack in the stone. Bracing her feet on the head of her weapon, RWBY fired off a dust shot at the ground in hopes to bind the girl to the floor, but Pyrrha rolled aside and spun to a knee, her shield leaving her arm and whirling through the air toward her. Smacking it aside, RWBY landed and rushed in against. Once again metal clashed with metal, this time scythe against sword, but the shield was quick to return. Clearly realizing she needed the reach, Pyrrha performed a perfect deflection and transformed her sword into its javelin form as the shield whirled around them both and provided the girl support. For what felt like another minute, the two of them clashed, each landing a few hits on the other, but RWBY knew she was quickly falling behind. Though Pyrrha and Ren's teamwork wasn't the best, especially compared to Ren and Nora's, the woman was an amazing solo fighter. So it was unsurprised that RWBY soon found herself laying on the floor with the buzzer ringing in her ears after a well-placed shield uppercut to her chin. "Ugh!" RWBY groaned, spreading her arms out and quite happy to stay where she was. "That one hurt." "You did really well," Pyrrha chuckled, holding out her arm. Reluctantly, she took it and let herself be pulled to her feet. "You're improving a lot." "Thanks," RWBY grunted and wiped off her skirt. "Miss Nikos is right, Miss Rose," Glinda confirmed, walking over and typing on her tablet. "Your results have been much better these past few weeks. One opponent down and Miss Nikos firmly in the yellow is nothing to be disappointed about." RWBY stared at the teacher with her mouth slightly open, and saw Pyrrha doing the same out of the corner of her eye. Though Professor Goodwitch was never mean, it was definitely rare to hear her handing out such compliments, but RWBY supposed she was right. Though she was certain she would have fared worse had Pyrrha been alone from the start, or if she had been with John, who was very good at organizing his team, the fact she had at least pushed Pyrrha down to yellow was something she was very proud of. "Thanks, Professor." RWBY smiled awkwardly at the older woman. With little more than a nod, the woman stalked over to Ren, who was sat with Nora's arms around his shoulders, the stone that had previously covered his chest long gone. Watching Pyrrha make her way over to her teammate too, RWBY turned back to her own team and quickly found herself pulled into a fight hug from her sister. "You were amazing!" Yang exclaimed happily, shaking her a little. "I told ya, you were a force to be reckoned with." Yeah, Yang," she breathed while being spooked in place. "You're going to break her aura," Weiss scolded, a glyph appearing between them to push them apart. "You did well." Giving her friend a smile, RWBY happily accepted the hug that quickly followed from her girlfriend. Ever since their argument, the two of them had been trying to fix things. A little more time had been spent training together instead of separately, and RWBY had been doing everything she could to reassure Blake that everything would be okay. Weiss and Yang had been helping too, and thankfully their efforts seemed to be paying off. Though she was still a little more quiet than usual, her appetite had returned and she was sleeping a lot better. "You were great," Blake smiled, placing a quick kiss on her and earning a choking sound from Yang, which quickly turned into real choking as Weiss elbowed her in the side. "See, you're not going to hurt anyone." "I guess," she breathed back. "But it was Pyrrha. She's a lot better than me, like a lot better, so I felt more comfortable." "You'll catch up in no time, sis." Yang grinned and punched her in the arm. "Don't think you're ever gonna beat me, though. I have a reputation to uphold." "Your reputation is one I would be eager to get rid of," Weiss jabbed jokingly, earning a stuck-out tongue from the blonde. "RWBY!" Glinda called over at them. "Please take your seat. Mr. Ark is waiting for his duel." "Oh," RWBY said, realizing that she was still on the stage. "Sorry, Professor." Walking back to her seat, RWBY gave John a thumbs up as he walked nervously to the fighting area. The boy was also improving quickly under Pyrrha's tutelage, and with the armor she had personally made for him, he was looking much more like a warrior, so RWBY was sure he would do well against Russell and Sky. So taking a seat next to her girlfriend and cuddling up, she settled in to watch her friend's duel. "I'm so glad I don't live in Vacuo," RWBY groaned as she rifled through the bestiary. "They have so many dangerous Grim. Like, look at this one." She held up the picture of a Xerath, a three-headed giraffe with leopard print skin and horns, to her girlfriend whose lap she was laid on, a hand slowly stroking through her hair. RWBY knew it was helping the girl stay calm and take her mind off her parents' impending arrival. Given that they were supposed to arrive tomorrow, RWBY was determined to not leave her girlfriend's side for even a moment. So despite it being the middle of class, she was quite happy to be stretched out on the bench with her head in Blake's lap. "It's 5 stories tall," she continued, "and it's common. Vacuo is pretty dangerous." Blake hummed with a gentle smile. "The blind worm, there is supposed to be one of the oldest living Grim." That's because it can grow back to full length if a single segment escapes. Yang chimed in. Kinda hard to kill the whole thing when half of it stays under the sand. True. Ruby hummed and flicked through the bestiary to a large, dragon-looking grim that took up 4 pages that needed to be unfolded. That's not the most dangerous one, though. Vacuole was the last place anyone saw the wyvern. Ruby, the wyvern is a myth. Weiss scowled and jotted down a note in her book. There's never been any proof it exists. Isn't that right, Professor? Port turned around and raised a bushy eyebrow at the heiress. Thankfully, the man said nothing about the fact Ruby was laid down on the bench, but the man had always been a little more relaxed when it came to his theory classes, though that would quickly change whenever they were actually fighting a grim. The wyvern? He asked, earning a nod from all of them. Ah yes, that magnificent beast. He laughed fondly, a tone Ruby definitely considered odd for anyone to use when talking about grim. As a young huntsman, I myself spent years looking for proof that one existed. I scoured the world-saving villages from sphinxes and leviathans, asking for nothing more than information as my reward, but alas, there was nothing. Even I have come to accept that the creature is little more than a myth that probably stems from a gigantic ravager that I would love to wrestle with. Thank you, Weiss replied smugly. Watching the man walk away with a sad look on his face, Ruby shook her head and flicked back to the xerox that she had been taking notes on for the assignment. Grim Studies was definitely one of her favorite classes. The chance to perform in-depth studies into creatures she knew she would be fighting one day was something she actually found very useful, as was learning how to properly document any new grim she may discover herself. So, Weiss, Yang said slowly, twirling her pen in hand and leaning down to rest on one arm. Have you made a decision yet? Weiss' smug grin immediately turned into a scowl that was shot at the blonde. No. No as in you won't accept, or no as in you haven't made a decision. The brawler grinned. Will you just dash? What are you talking about? Blake asked with a confused look. Weiss got asked out on a date. Don't you dash? By a flint. Damn it, Xiaolong. Ruby barely heard Weiss curse, as she had already dropped her book to look at her partner. She had definitely noticed something between the pair, especially with how her summons acted towards the boy, but she had no idea that things had already progressed to the point where he had asked her out. What? Ruby asked. Why didn't you tell me that happened? I didn't tell anyone. You told me. Correction. Weiss pointed at the blonde. I asked what you would do if someone who annoyed you asked you out. Everyone annoys me. Well, at least you admit it. Blake chuckled, her finger winding gently into Ruby's hair. Though you did kind of just admit that it was Flint. Ha. Ruby grinned happily. Weiss and FYNT, sitting in a tree. KISSING. Yang chimed in, dodging a shard of ice that was hurled at her from a glyph. Why are we focused on my love life? Weiss asked moodily and pointed to Ruby and Blake. Those two are the ones that have been glued together for nearly 2 full days. Yeah, but that's because Blake's super grumpy and Ruby is her doctor-prescribed emotional support girlfriend. It was Blake's turn to scowl at the blonde. Plus, they're old news. You and Flint, however, dash. There is no me and Flint, Weiss said testily. I still have no idea if I am even going to accept his date or not. But the fact you are even considering it means you do like him, right? Ruby asked. The girl didn't reply, and instead went a little pink. With her extremely pale complexion, the blush was even more obvious to see and caused Yang to snort with suppressed laughter. Feeling the need to defend her bestie, Ruby ripped a page from her book, scrunched it up, and threw it at her sister. I have no idea, Weiss replied defeatedly. I stand by what I said about him being an ass, but I would be lying if I said I didn't enjoy talking with him. Then why not just go on the date and find out? Blake said simply, her eyes returning to her own bestiary. Because I refuse to go on a date with just anyone, Weiss scowled. That is what Yang does. Hey, Yang said with an offended tone. I've been a taken woman for months now. You were the last person to have a friends with benefits relationship with someone. Ruby watched her best friend's mouth open to reply, only for it to fall as her eyes widened. Though Ruby had never really understood why Weiss had dated Neptune, she did know what they had been up to, though was thankful she had never walked in on it like she had her sister. Oh my She groaned and buried her face in her hands. I've turned into you. Despite feeling sympathy for her best friend's despair, Ruby let out a loud bark of laughter, while Blake used her book to hide her huge grin. Yang, however, was not laughing, instead pouting at the heiress. "You say that like it's a bad thing," she said sadly. "It is," Blake replied, her smirk still hidden. "A very bad thing." Ruby chuckled, dodging the paper that was thrown back at her. "Soon you will be dragging us all to clubs and drinking on a school night." "Please," Yang breathed and scrawled something on her notepad. "You all love team nights at the club." Ruby couldn't really disagree there, though it was definitely somewhere she shouldn't be allowed into, and she was the only one who didn't drink. The nights were generally a really fun time for the entire team, especially since it was usually Yang and Blake's personal thing, so being invited was something she and Weiss usually considered an honor. "When are we going out next, by the way?" Yang asked her partner quietly, making herself look busy as the classroom door opened and Professor Goodwitch walked in. "A new one just opened that I wanted to check out." "I don't know," Blake shrugged. "Maybe after my parents' visit is over. Still need to figure out what I'm doing abo. Miss Belladonna." Goodwitch's voice interrupted, causing Ruby to sit bolt upright before the woman scolded them. "I need you to come with me." The whole team shared a confused look with each other. "Have I done something wrong, Professor?" Blake asked, not moving just yet. "Whatever it was, I promise she's innocent," Yang said quickly, though earned a stern look from the teacher. "As much as I applaud your desire to protect your partner, Miss Belladonna is not in trouble," she said, and straightened her glasses. "Headmaster Ojban would simply like a word. Now if you would please." Giving the woman a nod, Blake quickly set about packing her books away. However, despite knowing Glinda would likely refuse her request, Ruby was still determined to fulfill her promise of being there for her girlfriend, so quickly sat up and looked at the teacher. "Can we come too?" To her surprise, the woman didn't immediately shoot her down. In fact, the vice principal looked around to each of them in turn and let out a contemplative hum. "Very well. You may join us." Both Yang and Weiss shared in Ruby's shock, but they all quickly recovered and began to shove their belongings into their bag. It was highly unusual for Glinda to pull a student away from their studies, and almost unheard of for her to allow a whole team to leave. So as Ruby shoved her bestiary into her bag, she couldn't help but be a little worried. The walk to the CCTS tower had been a quiet one, though that was hardly unusual when you were being escorted somewhere by Professor Goodwitch. Pretty much every student knew that they should never fool around in front of the vice principal or risk getting a week's worth of detention. What was unusual though was her refusal to answer any question they asked. Usually she was more than happy to inform them on certain things, especially why they were being led to the headmaster's office, but this time the woman was rather tightly-lipped, and that only made Ruby worry a little more. Thankfully, they didn't have to wait too long for their answers due to Professor Port's classroom not being too far from the CCTV and Goodwitch's long strides, so they very quickly found themselves in the moving elevator of the giant building. As it slowly climbed the floors, Ruby reached out and took her girlfriend's hand. Flashing her a quick smile and nod in hopes of making her feel a little better, she was happy to receive one in return. An anxious smile, but a smile nonetheless. Eventually, though, the doors of the elevator opened and Glinda ushered them out into the large clock room. The room itself was the same as every time she had been there. Large and mostly empty except for a large glass table on one end that was covered in files. As usual, a ghostly green glare emanated from the rotating gears and lit the cast everything in a gentle shade of emerald green. Stood by the giant window was Ojban, looking out over the city with cane and cup in hand. "Miss Belladonna for you, headmaster," Glinda said in a polite tone that seemed reserved for Ojban alone, and walked over to the side of his desk. "Thank you, Glinda," he replied kindly, turning around and taking a sip from his cup. "Sorry for pulling you away from your lesson, Miss Belladonna. I'm sure Professor Port was telling quite an amusing tale that you would love to have heard the end of." Despite his words, there was a hint of a smile on his face that showed he knew just how boring Professor Port's stories were. "He was actually teaching, for once," Glinda remarked. "Oh," Ojban raised an eyebrow. "Then I apologize even more for pulling you away from such a momentous occasion." Yang shorted in approval of the joke, but Ruby quickly elbowed her in the side. "However," his tone suddenly became more serious, "there is an important matter we must discuss. I trust you are comfortable with your team being here for this discussion?" Blake flashed them all a look before returning her gaze to the older man. Anything important can be said in front of my team, yes? She confirmed. Very well. He nodded and sat down in his chair, and pushed a file towards the edge of his desk. Looking down, Ruby saw a face she instantly recognized as Blake's dad, having seen it numerous times over the last few weeks. A few weeks ago, your parents left Menagerie on a diplomatic visit to Vale. Along the way, they had numerous check-in points, and they made each in good health. Ruby suppressed a groan as she sensed a becoming. That was until 2 days ago. He paused for a moment and pulled up a map of Sanus. Their final check-in point was 2 days ago here. He pointed to a small town just south of Mountain Glen called Zealand, where they were supposed to be picked up by airship and transported to the city. I'm afraid I have to inform you that they have yet to arrive. Ruby felt a pit in her stomach as she looked to her side. Blake's amber eyes had immediately filled with worry as thoughts raced behind them. Tightening her grip on her girlfriend's hand as Yang placed a hand on her shoulder, she looked back to the headmaster with desperate eyes. Do you know if they are okay? We believe they are for now, Ashman said with a nod. We received word a few hours ago that the captain of their guard, Saber Redentia, made it to the village. From his report, we know that they were ambushed by Grimm, and he was forced to cover their retreat. He's assured us that he's left his best officers with them, and that they will keep them safe, but is asking the Vale Council for backup so that he can locate them. But they're okay? Blake asked in a shaky voice. We can't be sure, but we believe so, Ashman said in a soft tone. The council is reaching out to available huntsmen now, but with the recent assault on the wall and other active missions, it might take a few days before they can assist. A few days? Jan growled angrily. Anything can happen in a few days. Jan! Ruby hissed at her sister, with a slight glance towards Blake. Not helping. She turned back to Ashman. Is there no way to get them quicker? I'm afraid not, Miss Rose. Ashman shook his head sadly. With the ever-increasing threat of the Grimm, our huntsmen and huntresses are extremely busy. The council is already moving as fast as they can. So what if we go? Ruby blurted out without thinking. It was a stupid plan, but it was better than leaving Blake's parents to the Grimm for however long it took the council to approve a team for the mission. If everyone else is busy, we can head in and extract them. This is a delicate mission, Miss Rose, Ashman said with a shake of his head. I'm afraid I cannot give it to a first dash. With all due respect, Headmaster, Weiss chimed in, stepping forward and giving the headmaster a firm look. This was a diplomatic visit, and Blake is the chieftain's daughter. With them missing, I'm pretty sure Vital's peace laws between the kingdoms dictates that the right to recommend who is sent on missions regarding her kingdom falls to her. Even still, as first years, Ashman still has the right to refuse. And that law would only apply if Menagerie was a kingdom, Miss Schnee, Glinda interjected. Which it dash should be recognized as. Ashman cut her off firmly. Pausing for a full minute, he looked at each of them in turn and pressed his fingers together. Ruby had thought her request a stupid one that would never be accepted, but Weiss' point seemed to have given Ashman reason to reconsider. Miss Schnee is right, he said after the minute was up. Should Miss Belladonna accept her team as recipients of this mission, then I am forced to consider it. But please take into consideration the severity of this mission, Miss Belladonna. This is not just your average seek and destroy, this is your parents' lives and a situation you first years have yet to prepare yourselves for in full. This will not be like the school's tasks in the Emerald Forest. Ruby turned to Blake, who had yet to really say much. She couldn't imagine what Blake was going through, having been too young to remember what had gone through her own mind when her mom had vanished, but she knew from the girl's furrowed brow that she was worried. And though she really wanted to support her, she also didn't want to appear as if she was trying to sway her decision. If Blake was going to let them accept the mission, she wanted it to be because she believed they would get it done. Blake looked at them all, Jan giving a thumbs up while Weiss gave a nod. I don't want to sit here worrying about them. She breathed quietly, though took a deep breath and looked Ashman firmly in the eyes. So if you'll allow us, Team RWBY accepts this mission. They all waited patiently as Ashman surveyed them over his tiny glasses and tinted fingers. If Glinda was being honest, then Blake's blessing meant nothing if the man decided they weren't allowed to take it on. But Ruby really hoped he would. While she definitely wouldn't complain about it, keeping Blake's mood from dipping over the last few days had been difficult, and she knew that it would be almost impossible to keep that up if the girl was forced to wait in her room and do schoolwork until the council finally sent someone out. though Ruby was definitely still aware of how their last mission had fared, and the argument that had caused it to almost fail. And though she was definitely a little cautious that Blake's worry about her parents would attract more Grimm, she would still rather they be out there looking than sitting around doing nothing. "Glinda," Ojpin said after what felt like 5 minutes, as he stood up and walked back to the window. "How would you rate their performance in the field so far? You're not seriously thinking about letting them go, are you?" The only reply she received was Ojpin sipping from his mug, but it seemed like nothing less than she expected. "Unorthodox," she huffed, "but efficient. Though I would like the record to show that, while they took down the Helk, they still have a long way to go." "Noted," Ojpin nodded. "Are you sure this is what you want, Blake?" The girl gave another look at them all, but her previously worried amber eyes finally showed conviction. "It is." "Very well," he said in a low hum. "I shall allow you to take this mission on one condition." He turned around and gave them a stern look that rivaled his vice principal's. "You will do everything that Mr. Redensha tells you to do. No questioning him, no doing things your own way. You will follow his instructions to the letter. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Headmaster," they all echoed. "Good," he said with a nod and sat back down. "Then you are excused from all of your remaining classes to prepare. Glinda, they are all yours." "Yes, Headmaster," the woman said, standing to attention and striding towards the door. "Follow me." Letting out a deep breath, they turned and followed the professor from the room. As they did, Ruby slipped her hand back into Blake's and gave her another reassuring smile. It was definitely going to be the most difficult mission they had ever been on, but if it was what they had to do to get Blake's parents home safely and stop their friend from worrying, Ruby knew her team were definitely up to the task. Chapter 51, Zealand. The sound of the airship's engine filled her ears as Blake stood at the open side hatch with the cold night wind blowing through her hair and watched the ground below her slowly shrink. As it did, she couldn't help but feel a certain amount of dread begin to weasel its way back into her mind. The last 15 hours had not been good ones. For the first 3 hours after being told that her parents were missing, the entire team had been locked in a room with Professor Goodwich to discuss the mission. It wasn't incredibly complex, but it was predicted to last at least 3 days. Due to Mountain Glen being too dangerous to travel through, the Menagerie Convey had no choice but to fly over it if they wished to get to Vale. Unfortunately, while Zealand would have been a perfect pickup point for a healthy, on-time convoy, Glinda and the Council were worried that the Grimm attack would have caused some panic among the convoy that would attract too many Grimm for Zealand's defenses to handle extraction. So instead, they were being instructed to lead the survivors to Secure, a bigger town with better defenses where the airships could land more safely, though they still had to track them down first. Unfortunately, the Grimm attack had taken place in a dead zone that was beyond reach of any of the CCTS support towers that were placed between kingdoms. And given that the caravan had yet to call in, Glinda had felt certain they were still somewhere within that 10-mile square. Thankfully, that wasn't too large an area, but it was still large enough that it could take at least a day to find them. The meeting had been the best part of the day, though. The second it had ended, Blake no longer had anything to take her mind off of the reality of the situation. While Glinda was confident her parents were alive, and her entire team were trying to make sure she believed that, Blake couldn't help but fear the opposite. None of them had lived outside a kingdom. None of them truly knew how horrible it could be. Attacks could come from nowhere, and lives could be ended in seconds. And with the only thing to keep her occupied being packing for the mission, she had already broken down in tears twice. Thankfully, Blake knew she would be better when getting to Zealand, and she had made sure to reassure Ruby of that fact. Looking over to her girlfriend, who was talking to the pilot, she recalled the conversation they'd had after the meeting with Glinda. "You guys go ahead." Ruby stopped next to the dorm room and looked to Weiss and Yang. "We need to talk for a second." Yang gave a nod, and the two walked into the room, leaving Blake and Ruby in an empty hallway. Putting her hands in her pockets, Blake looked curiously at her girlfriend. "You doing okay?" the Reaper asked, though quickly shook her head. "Sorry, of course you're not. Stupid question." "I'm processing," Blake breathed with a shrug. "I'm just scared we'll be too late. It's been 3 days since the attack already. What if Dash?" "They're not," Ruby said, reaching out to put a hand on her shoulder. "Glinda says they were heavily guarded, so they're likely fine. You've just gotta keep hoping, okay?" "Hard to keep hoping when you know what it's like being out there," Blake replied sullenly. "I promise we'll find them, okay?" Ruby smiled reassuringly. Letting the girl pull her into a hug, Blake buried her face into Ruby's hair to take in the comforting smell of strawberries. Lingering for a second, she let out a small sigh and gave a nod. Good. Ruby hummed and pulled back, her comforting gaze suddenly turning serious. But I need to say something. The girl took a deep breath, and the little uncertainty that was in her eyes faded into resolve. You said it yourself, this mission is pretty dangerous. Ruby began slowly. So I need you to follow my orders. This isn't the Emerald Forest or Patch. This is outside of city protection, and we can't have anything go wrong, so we can't be snapping at each other and getting angry. So what I say goes. Okay. Blake definitely understood why it was something Ruby had been worried about. Their last mission had not exactly gone as planned, and it was mostly her own fault. It had been her who had constantly brought Grimm to them, her who had given away their position and caused them to lose the tactical advantage, her who had snapped and left the clearing and slowed down the clearing of the river. Of course, she still stood by what she said of Ruby trying to defend her unnecessarily, but she knew she had made a lot of mistakes too. Okay, she had agreed in response. I'll follow your orders. Just please promise me you won't be trying to save my life from everything. Like you said, this isn't the Emerald Forest, and that will get you killed out there. If I need help, I promise I'll call for it, okay? She had been very thankful when Ruby had agreed to not interfere unless specifically asked. Ruby's acceptance of sacrificing herself was still something she was unsure how she would handle in the future. It had only been 3 months, but Blake was already crazy about the girl, and the idea of losing her one day was something that she really wasn't ready to accept, especially if it was to protect her. Unfortunately, though, that was something she was going to have to learn to accept since she definitely didn't want the relationship to come to an end. After all, Ruby's selflessness was something that she really loved about her girlfriend, and yesterday had proven just how selfless she was. Without prompting or hesitation, the girl had accepted a mission that had nothing to do with her. She hadn't cared about it being an important one that could earn the team some glory, but simply because she wanted to help. She wanted to help those who were lost, and she wanted to help Blake herself by not letting her stew in uncertainty while waiting in a room. No matter the situation, Ruby's first thought was always someone else, though Blake certainly hadn't expected such quick agreements from her other team members. Of course, Yang had always been headstrong and brash, but when it came to Ruby being in dangerous situations, she was usually very cautious. And Weiss was just cautious by nature. So the fact that both of them had immediately jumped to Ruby's defense had meant a lot to Blake. So, despite being tired due to having not slept at all the night before, she flashed a grateful smile toward the pair who were sitting on the bench and returned to watching the city zoom past her below. We've got a Nevermore flock, the pilot called from the front seat. Watching her girlfriend jump up from her seat and rush to the cockpit, Blake reached up and grabbed the safety bar to brace for the evasive maneuvers that were likely about to happen. Looking out of the open side panel, she saw 3 large black birds with bone-plated faces soaring through the sky behind them. Can you outrun them? The girl asked. No, he replied, but I can stay ahead of them so long as we don't slow down. All right. How far till Zealand? Roughly 7 minutes. Okay, just keep going for now, Ruby ordered him, earning a nod from the man. Standing up from her own seat as Ruby stepped out of the cockpit, Blake pulled her weapon from her back and shifted it into gun form. Yang followed suit and cocked her gauntlets back. So what's the plan, Rubes? The blonde grinned eagerly. We going skeet shooting? Just keep them at bay until we get to Zealand, Ruby ordered. They have too much of an advantage for us to fight them right now. Pulling a pair of aviators from her breast pocket, Yang swung herself up and out of the side door, landing on the roof of the airship with a thud. With a flourish of her hand, a black glyph appeared in Wei's hand, and she knew another would be keeping Yang's feet secure. Getting ready to follow her partner, Blake checked her magazine and walked towards the door, only to feel a hand on her arm. They'll tear the ship apart if we slow down, Ruby said quickly and precisely. I'll have the pilot fly low over Zealand, and we'll have to jump. When Weiss releases her glyph, find her because there isn't a lot for you to swing off of in a small town. Got it. She nodded quickly, hearing Yang begin to fire above her. Leaning in, she gave her girlfriend a brief peck on the cheek. And be safe, Ruby smiled. I'll see you on the ground. Will do. Looking towards Weiss, who produced another glyph in her hand, Blake turned and swung herself onto the roof beside her partner. Though the wind was tearing through her hair and stinging her eyes a little, the black glyph at her feet kept her safe. Flicking the safety off her gun, she pointed it towards the nearest Nevermore and fired a round off. While the fact that they were already under attack by 3 large Grimm certainly didn't fill Blake with much hope for their mission, the few minutes that she stood beside her partner and constantly repelled the feathered fiends were a very welcome distraction. For those few minutes, she wasn't able to think about what they might find when they got to searching, or what her parents would say if she saw them. All she had to focus on was hitting the targets before her. And since they were constantly moving and avoiding their bullets, it was more than enough to keep her focused. "What do you say, Blakey?" Yong smirked as the ship finally began to descend and the glyphs flickered in warning. "Want to give them a goodbye gift?" Rolling her eyes at her partner, she took a knee and took aim as Yong rapidly fired 4 rockets at the birds. Closing one eye, she popped off 4 rounds of her own, each colliding with her partner's, and setting off a large explosion that flung 2 of the birds aside and filled the air with smoke. Before the creatures could recover, Blake felt the glyph around her feet release and allowed herself to slip off the side of the ship. Scanning her surroundings, she spotted the white-haired Harris sliding down her knight's giant sword a few meters away and tossed out her sickle. As it flew through the air, a white glyph appeared from nowhere and produced a short icicle to catch it. If there was one thing Weiss excelled at, it was multitasking, and while producing her own glyphs that allowed her to slide down gracefully to the ground, she also kept up the production small icicles for Blake to latch herself onto to slow her momentum, until eventually she landed perfectly on the ground next to her friend. Seconds later, Ruby burst out of nowhere in a shower of petals, and Yong landed in a well-controlled skid that ended with an arm around her little sister. "You know," Yong grinned and pushed her aviators up. "I think we can stand to skip a few landing strategy classes at this rate." Shaking her head, while Ruby worked on untangling herself from her sister, Blake looked up just in time to see the ship veer right and narrowly avoid the large Grimm before soaring off back towards Vale with them in tow. Returning her gaze to the town before her and hoping the pilot made it home safe, she looked around the small square that she was standing in. It really wasn't very big, barely the size of Beacon's amphitheater, but that was to be expected since the town was so small that she could see all 4 walls from where she stood. Nevertheless, the people that were standing gazing at them looked well and happy, if only a little perplexed by the 4 girls suddenly standing in their midst. On either side of the square, rickety old stalls filled with a range of goods were shoddily constructed and managed by people who looked at them with hopeful eyes. Alcohol, breads, cheeses, dust, weapons, pots, as well as an assortment of random objects. With Zealand being more of a trading stop and the usual go-to for any Vale pickups, Blake had to assume the merchants did quite well for themselves. "Feels a little like home," Ruby breathed, looking around wistfully at the surrounding area. Blake could definitely see the resemblance to Patch. "But we should try and find Saber." "Consider me found," a rough voice said from behind them. "Quite an in-rank dash." As they turned, the man cut himself off and stood to attention, his legs snapping together and his arms pressed against his side. He looked rather different than the last time she saw him. Instead of a full head of hair, the sides of his head were shaved, leaving a short line of brown hair down the middle. His usually youthful face looked older with a scraggly beard and a long scar that stretched over his right eye and past his hairline. As per usual, he wore the menagerie uniform, a black and white robe with a yellow belt and steel plates located on his arms and waist. "Madame Belladonna." Immediately feeling nervous as Ruby and Yong cast her a curious look, Blake blushed a little and raised a hand. It had been so long since she had been home that she'd forgotten just how awkward it was to be greeted in such a way by the island's guards. "No need to be so formal, Saber," she mumbled as the man relaxed. "Sorry," he said, giving a bow of his head anyway. "We heard back home that you left the White Fan, but had no idea where you disappeared to. Your parents were beyond worried." Blake's eyes widened a little at the man's words. She figured that her parents would have heard she'd left, but the fact that they were worried filled her with even more guilt and uncertainty. Had her teammates been right after all? Had she really been stupid in thinking that a call from her would have unwelcome? "Blake's been with us at Beacon," Ruby said happily, taking a step forward and holding out her hand. "Ruby Rose, leader of Team RWBY. I didn't name it, I swear." The man gave a grunt and took her hand. "Nice to meet you," he said with a sense of caution that she understood. Like many faunus on Menagerie, the man had a good reason to be uncomfortable around humans. I didn't expect Vale to send someone so young. Council hunters were busy. Yang shrugged. So you got the best team at Beacon instead. Yang! Ruby hissed at the blonde before turning back to the man. Professor Ojpin wouldn't have sent us if he didn't think we could handle it, she corrected Yang reassuringly. I guess not. He turned to Yang and offered out his hand. Yang, she called you? The one and only. Yang beamed and shook his hand for a second. I'm Blake's partner. Unfortunately. Shush, you love me. A flicker of a smile pulled at Blake's face. And this is my partner, Weiss. Schnee. Saber cut Ruby off with a hint of a sneer, retracting his hand that had previously been held out towards Weiss. If Weiss had been insulted at all, she didn't show it. Retracting her own hand which had been reaching for Saber's, she simply gave the man a small nod instead. It's an honor to be working with a skilled huntsman, she said in a kind tone that was rare to hear from the girl, so rare in fact that they all cast her a glance. Yes, well, he looked away from the heiress and back to Ruby. I suppose you were sent with a plan? We should go over it so that we can get out there and search. Oh, right, Ruby replied. Yes. 1 second. The man gave a nod and walked away to stand next to a food stand, the owner handing him a pear. All right, girls, Ruby breathed, turning around to address them with her hands on her hips. We should gather some information and supplies while we're here. Weiss, you talk to the people in S-. I don't think that's a good idea, Rubes. Yang interrupted and motioned to the people around them. There are a lot of faunas here. Blake hummed in agreement. They wouldn't exactly be keen to talk to a Schnee. Thanks. Weiss huffed and crossed her arms. That makes sense, I guess. Ruby winced apologetically as Weiss scowled at her. All right, Yang can talk to the people and see what Grimm are in the area or if they know anywhere Blake's parents might have made camp. Weiss, you and Blake can pick up some food and stuff. Just enough to last us a few days will be fine. Ah! Yang cooed happily, pulling Ruby into a bear hug and lifting her off the ground. Look at my little sis being a great leader. Gah! Yang! Ruby whined, kicking her feet to escape. This is a serious mission. Let me go. I'm so proud of you. Yang grinned happily, plunking the Reaper back down and poking her nose. Now, go do leader stuff with Saber. We'll handle things out here. Dummy. Ruby breathed, straightening out her skirt and hair. Okay. We'll meet back here in an hour. Understood. Weiss nodded, her scowl having faded and her posture once again relaxed. Good. Ruby smiled at them all. Team RWBY's mission has officially begun. All right, Weiss said with a grimace, placing a few packs of dried meat into her backpack. That's all the disgusting food we should need for a few days. Better than nothing. Blake mumbled and handed the girl the bread. I'll take your word for it. Weiss sighed, lifting the pack onto her back. Just us left? MHM. For the past 40 minutes, the two of them had been wandering around the square in search of things that could be useful for the trip. Unfortunately, most of the merchants seemed to have recognized Weiss, and a vast majority of the time with each one had been spent haggling down prices that had likely been jacked up after the owners realized who they were talking to. Not that Weiss was having any of it, having immediately recognized what was happening and refusing to pay a lien more than what she thought the things were worth. Eventually, though, they had retrieved most of the things they had needed. Food, water, a few sleeping bags, torches, matches, pretty much everything they needed to survive a few days in the dead zone. All that was left was the dust which was sold from a stall a fair distance from the others. As they approached, she saw the man pull a hood over his head to hide his mouse ears, and a loud sigh escaped from Weiss. Sorry, Blake said to her friend. Though she certainly understood why the faunas acted in such a way around her, she did feel bad for her friend. It's just instinct. It's fine, the heiress said with a shrug. I mean, it's not. I hate that they think I am like my father, but less than a year ago, they wouldn't exactly have been wrong. You've changed a lot since then, Blake countered. Not like any of that matters when he shares my family name. Weiss sneered bitterly, though quickly shook her head. I'm guessing this will be common when we find your parents too. If we find TH-. When we find them. Glancing to the side, she saw Weiss' blue eyes giving her a firm look. Knowing she wouldn't accept any other verbiage, Blake looked away. Not from my parents. she said, sidestepping the issue altogether. But probably from the guards, yes. Menagerie is full of faunas who were treated badly by humans, or were raised by people who were in the faunus war. So they aren't exactly the most comfortable around humans. Wise simply gave a small hum of acknowledgement as they reached the stand, and she reached out to pick up one of the dust crystals. Holding it up to the light, she peered into it intently and shook her head. I suppose that's fair. Wise sighed and gently placed the crystal into a slotted basket. Anyway, she picked up another and shook her head again. I hope you heard what Saber said, that your parents were worried about you. I did, she admitted, leaning back against the side of the stand. Good, Wise said, picking up another crystal. So please tell me you are going to stop being stupid and thinking that they do not wish to see you. Blake let out a small sigh and crossed her arms. Though she knew Saber enough to know that his words were likely true, she still found it hard to believe that her parents wouldn't be at least a little angry with her. Of course they would be worried. She was their daughter after all. But that didn't mean they wouldn't be angry with her for all she had done. I dunno, she shrugged. You're starting to sound like you want them to be mad at you. Maybe I do, Blake admitted sullenly. They have every right to be. Maybe they do, Wise agreed. But you can hardly fix that by avoiding it. I'm not the only one who has been making an effort to grow, you know. You've also been facing your past this last year. I remember at the start of the semester you threatened to beat up 2 boys for harassing Velvet. I would have if Velvet hadn't stopped me. And would you now? Blake shook her head. While that anger was still inside of her, it was definitely a lot easier to calm herself than before. See, growth. A hand landed on her shoulder, and a wave of warmth rushed through her as Wise's bracelet lit up. Don't go back to your old ways now. Trust me, it's not fun. Staring into her friend's eyes for a second, she found the usually ice-cold gaze to be soft and kind. It was always nice to see Wise behave in such a way, so she gave the girl a small smile as the hand was removed and the heiress went back to rifling through the dust. Thanks, Blake said genuinely. Between your advice and standing up to Ojban, you're kinda making me feel bad for shouting at you the other day. You should. Wise smirked, though quickly let out a chuckle at the grimace on Blake's face. I am joking, Blake. We argue every week. I quite enjoy it, actually. You do? Well, Ruby is a pushover and Yang turns everything into a joke. The girl shrugged. It's nice having a friend who isn't afraid to talk back to me. Oh, I take my apology back then. Good. Wise smiled with a sidelong glance. However, rest assured that you will have the full extent of my summons available to you this time. Though it was a small gesture, Blake greatly appreciated it. Thanks. MHM. Wise hummed, picking up a final dust crystal and placing the basket in the center of the stand. Dispose of these, she ordered. WH what? The merchant stuttered at Wise's direct order. Why? They are unstable and likely to get someone killed if touched incorrectly. She scowled impatiently. Do you not check the quality of the dust you buy? Poor guy, Blake thought to herself as Wise began to lecture him on the importance of proper dust practices. With it being one of the things the girl was most passionate about, Blake knew the heiress wouldn't be leaving until she got her way. Poor guy, a voice said behind her, mirroring her thoughts exactly. Turning around, she saw her partner strolling towards them, her hands in the pockets of her black pants. While doing their shopping, Blake had seen the girl making her way around the residence of Zealand, and while a lot could be said for her manners and ego, the residents clearly liked her because many had been laughing and more than happy to converse with the blonde. Hey, Blake greeted her, throwing the sleeping bags at the girl since she was the strongest. Anything we should worry about? Not here, Yang replied, her tone a little off, and she glanced towards the vendor. Ruby wants us to meet her in the town hall. Oh. The fact that Yang wasn't willing to talk was more than enough to worry her a little. Okay. Wise. Yeah. Wise grumbled as she pocketed her scroll, picking up a few vials of dust powder and throwing down some lean and a magnifying glass. I heard you, she said, pocketing the vials and turning back to the man. Use that magnifying glass to check the dust. The manual I sent you will show you what to look for. It's dangerous enough out here without people blowing themselves up with faulty dust. Turning away from the shocked faunus, Weiss readjusted her backpack and they set off towards the largest building in the town. So, Yang stretched as they all gathered around a large table that was projecting a holographic map of the area. They gave me the location of 3 areas that Blake's parents might be held up. Reaching out, the blonde pointed to the section of the map that was mostly covered in trees. First is here, she said, and circled her finger, a red marker appearing around the location. There's a ruined temple deep in the woods. They said it's not exactly the best place to set up camp since there isn't much room to move, but there's plenty of cover from Grimm. Saber hummed and tapped a button on the table to show the road. It's worth keeping in mind, but it's too far away from the roads and the forest is too densely packed for the trucks to make it through. All right. The blonde nodded and reached over to a clearing. The second is this clearing here. It's open with great sight lines, the perfect place to camp. There's even a tower there that we could see above the trees as we flew in. Blake remembered seeing that tower just before the Nevermore attack. But the tower seems to attract Grimm for some reason. We're used to Grimm, Saber smiled, circling the area. But Gyra doesn't like to put people in danger, so might have picked somewhere else. Where's the third? Here. Yang reached out to the river. There are some caves along the riverbed that are good for shelter. The people said the river has fresh fish in it too. That's probably where he'll go. Blake chimed in, circling the coves herself. Faunists like to be closer to natural structures than man-made ones. Plus, the river would be great for feeding the people, keeping them clean, and keeping up morale. I agree. Saber nodded and ran his finger along a road that ran nearby. There is also access for the trucks, so the odds are that they're probably there. How about the Grimm? Yang's face fell a little at that question, just like it had when she'd asked the same question earlier. It was highly unusual for the blonde to show uncertainty in the face of Grimm, and Blake once again felt a small bit of worry seep in. For the most part, the usual, she answered. Beowulf packs, Ursai creeps. Blake really hated creeps. King Taijutsu, griffins, and Nevermores to name a few, but there are some others. Flourishing her hand over the map, she continued. The north of the river is apparently taken over by a large gaggle of gums. This entire east road here is Berserker and Deathstalker territory. And a bunch of Kamaitachi have recently moved into the woods here. With each area, Yang marked off the map with a black ring. Though gums could certainly be dangerous in large numbers, they weren't the most difficult Grimm to handle, so Blake felt relatively comfortable with those being the Grimm that were closest to her parents. Berserkers and Deathstalker, on the other hand, were definitely not something she wanted to encounter. The hulking brutes and giant scorpions were enough to give a skilled hunter a hectic fight even on the best of days, so to go into their territory on foot would be extremely reckless. As for Kamaitachis, Blake had never heard of them before, but neither Yang nor Ruby seemed too worried about them when they were mentioned. ALRI-. Ruby began, only to be cut off by her sister. That's not all, she said in a more hushed, cautious tone. The villagers didn't really talk about it much. I don't even think they know what's doing it, but they keep finding bodies near the west wall. I would guess people find a lot of bodies out here, Yang, Weiss said skeptically. Not like this, Yang countered. They have no marks. No scratches, not bites, no puncture wounds, nothing. They're just dead, and always with their hands reaching for the wall. A shiver ran through the group, and they all exchanged a look. How many people have they found? Ruby asked. 6 in the last month, Yang breathed. And the guards said it's getting more frequent. They also said it looks like the people crawled their way there, but the trails led back to the dead zone, and everybody in the village is forbidden from entering there. So there's something out in the dead zone trying to get into the village? Blake asked, having no idea what Grimm would act in such a way. Most likely, Yang confirmed. But nobody's ever seen the body show up. They only find it hours later. Saber hummed, looking at the map and scratching the side of his gerbil teeth. That's definitely an issue, but we can't exactly prepare for it without knowing what it is. And we can't delay our search to investigate either. If we come across whatever this is, then we gather as much intel as we can and either kill it or leave. We can report our findings when we get back to Vale, and the council can take it from there. Understood, sir, Ruby said, though Weiss and Yang looked ready to raise an issue with it. We're here to follow your orders. As the man led back down to study the map, Blake watched Ruby cast a pointed look at her sister and partner, making it clear that she too had seen that they were about to argue with the man. After both of them relented and shrugged, she pointed to the second spot Yang had marked, the tower. I'm thinking we head there first, she said. It's closer, and will give us a great view of the area. It'll also give us a point to navigate from since our scrolls won't be able to mark our locations. That's a good idea. The man nodded and pressed a button to print off a few copies of the map with its markings. Depending on how many Grimm we encounter, we should be able to reach the river nightfall. Sounds like a plan. Ruby smiled at him, accepting one of the maps that was handed to her. Good. We leave in 10 minutes then. With that, the man pulled the bag over his shoulder and left the room. Left in just silence, Weiss finally turned on Ruby with a raised eyebrow. You are really going to just let the Grimm go if we encounter it? We don't have a choice, Ruby countered. I want to kill it too if it's trying to get into the village, but we have no idea what it is, and Blake's parents are the priority here. Ashpin ordered us to follow Saber's instructions to the letter, so that is what we have to do. He's more experienced, and knows what he's doing. The two girls stared at each other intently, bright silver meeting hard blue. Though it wasn't unusual to see them disagree on something, it was never something so serious as letting a Grimm go. And Blake could definitely see why Weiss was surprised, as it seemed like a very un-Ruby thing to do. But as selfish as it was, the only thing she felt was gratitude that her girlfriend was putting her need to find her parents first. Eventually, though, Weiss shook her head and raised a hand in defeat. Fine. The girl groaned and picked up the food bag. You are the leader. Thank you, Ruby breathed, picking up her own bag. Now we should probably get going. Right. Jan agreed, lifting the sleeping bags onto her back. But for the record, I'm with Weiss on this one. As the two girls left the room, Ruby let out a low sigh and shook her head. Blake knew the girl was definitely with them too, but as a leader, she was having to put aside her desires for the mission. So reaching out a hand and giving her girlfriend a warm smile, she entwined their fingers and led the girl out of the room, hoping that they would find her parents safe and sound before night's end.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.